Well, thank you for coming over and
thanks for having me
today. Yeah, you're only in the country for a few days, so we
That's
appreciate true. You making the trip out to speak here and then cross the road at the School of Government. So for the event, I'm going to start off with asking a few questions, and after that, we'll be happy to take any questions from the audience. So I hope you've got a few good ideas lined up.
Okay.
So recently, we've seen not just your own dismissal, but the dismissal of two of your colleagues, FBI Director James Comey, and also Acting Attorney General Sally Yates, after she ordered Department of Justice lawyers not to defend President Trump's executive order on travel and immigration. Do you think there's still an environment today in the United States where civil servants are prepared to stand up to the president and really exercise independence in discharging their duties?
So that's a great question. Before I get to it, I want to say thank you for having me here at Oxford. It's my first time here. Greetings from President Trump. Actually, I'm kidding. He doesn't care about you at all. So that's a joke too. I think. So it's a difficult question. Obviously, as you described, my office and how we think of ourselves as the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York, and the law enforcement function, I think in any country that's democratic, has to be independent from the political function. So the issue of independence is something that's uniquely applicable, I think, to the law enforcement function. It is not the case that the Foreign Secretary here or the Defense Secretary of the United States or the Secretary of State can decide to thumb his or her nose at a direct command of the president. Law and order and justice is different. So uniquely among agencies, I think in the United States and other places, the obligation of either a United States attorney or an attorney general is to do the right thing. You don't serve, I would always say to my folks in my office, I don't serve this president, I never served any president of the United States, although I was appointed by him. I serve the public and the interests of justice. So in that context, I do think there are people who take the oath of office when they come into the Department of Justice, and I hope in other places as well, who are loyal to their oath and not loyal to a president. There has been some reporting on the issue of whether or not President Trump, over dinner with Jim Comey, my former boss and someone who remains my friend, asked him for loyalty. I don't know if that's true. I'm not suggesting it is or is not. But loyalty on the part of public servants like myself who are in law enforcement is owed to the oath and is owed to the public and is owed to justice, not to any president. And I think there are enough people who are public servants and civil servants in the Justice Department that if push comes to shove, they will do exactly what some others have done and not violate their oath and do something that they believe in good faith and consistent with the law and their conscience is unlawful. So I like to think that there are plenty of those people still.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that raises an interesting question, I suppose. And how do you draw the line between maintaining this independence and really not defying or committing insubordination against elected officials and elected representatives?
So that's a difficult question. As I said, the U.S. Attorney's Office is independent and prides itself on independence. Mine in particular, we're the Southern District of New York, which encompasses Manhattan, the Bronx, and a number of other counties as well, in case you don't know the geography. We are proud of our nickname, which is the Sovereign District of New York. We boast, there was a United States Attorney in my district before there was a Department of Justice. The first United States Attorney in New York was nominated by a president who you may have heard of from America named Washington in 1789 on a handwritten, in handwriting on a piece of paper, on the same piece of paper on which Washington nominated for Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. So we take the obligation and tradition, it's not as old as some of my environs here, but it's pretty old for America. And so we take that obligation very, very seriously. On issues of the law and what our interpretation of the law is, I think you have an absolute obligation and right to do what you think is correct according to the law. So if you're given an unlawful direction or a direction to do something you think might violate the law, then you owe the duty to not do it. And you can be fired for that reason, or you can decide to resign, and we can discuss the differences in those if you want. Where I think you have less leeway is on issues of policy. So for example, on the question of whether or not it was a good idea for the President of the United States to decide to restrict certain kinds of people from coming into the United States, if that was a mere policy question, and people can debate this as well, and I'm not taking a position, then I think you have less leeway to be defiant and to say you're not going to do it. And if you don't like the policies of the president that you have been, that has appointed you or who is currently in office, then you should leave. In the same way that if you're working for someone in Parliament or in Congress, nothing says you have to work for that person. And if that person says, I want you to draft me legislation that says X or Y, if you don't believe in it, then you don't have to work there. And so on the issue of whether or not certain kinds of resources should be spent on certain kinds of crimes, that's a little bit of a harder thing to defy. We still think in the field, because the U.S. attorneys sit in the field, and there are 93 of us, or 92 of us, that we know best how to make sure that we achieve public safety and justice in our own districts. And so there's always a back and forth. That's true. I think that's true of any agency in the world where you have a mothership and you have people out in the field, whether you're talking about foreign policy or you're talking about justice. And I think there's a natural give and take between what the people in the field think is best and what the folks at the center think. And the last example is, it would be not fair, I think, and I think against justice if, say, the Attorney General decided that with respect to certain kinds of crimes, we're going to treat them this way, or we're going to have a certain policy with respect to guilty pleas. Unless you think it's unlawful or you have a problem with it, you can leave, but you can't have within one sort of unified legal system a different result if you happen to have committed your crime in California and a different result if you happen to have committed your crime in New York. So I think for purposes of uniformity and fairness, you have to be careful not to be defiant with respect to policy. But there's a lot of gray area with respect to all of those.
Yeah. So picking up on your answer just now, you were asked by the Attorney General for your resignation.
I was asked by the acting Deputy Attorney General.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is important to me because okay.
You declined to tender your resignation.
I did.
And then the next day you were dismissed.
It took them a while to fire me. It took 24 hours.
Well, he's meant to be good at firing people, so...
That's what I said the same. In fact, my understanding was that's how he got to be president.
Yeah. So is that what you would advise to your colleagues still in the field and in office today? If they come up against something that they believe to be illegal, they believe it to be a legal question and they don't agree with what they're being asked to do you think they should hold their ground and not resign and wait to be sacked?
Yeah, so my situation I think was different, and I didn't hear all of your introduction, but the reason I did that was twofold, or maybe threefold. The natural order of events is a new president gets elected from the opposing party or even from the same party in the United States, and presidentially appointed people who came in under the prior president, you pack your bags and you go eventually over time. And I completely expected to leave and waited for my invitation to come to speak at the Oxford Union, which didn't come in November. But then with great fanfare, the president-elect, through a United States senator for whom I worked, reached out to me and asked me to come visit with him to persuade me to stay for another term as United States Attorney, which is unusual. And I took it to mean that he understood the work that our office was doing. He's a New Yorker. Our work and I are in the paper in New York, virtually every day. He was familiar with the great nonpartisan work that we did, the political corruption work that we did. In fact, he asked to meet with me at Trump Tower on the 26th floor with Steve Bannon and Jared Kushner. We're both in the room. All three of them were in the room. Everyone behaved nicely then with each other and with me, and I was asked to stay. That happened before he had actually picked the Secretary of State. There was still a debate about who would be the Secretary of State before he picked the Secretary of Defense. So I took that to mean something, and so the combination of his asking me to stay uniquely among United States attorneys, two, the jurisdiction that I had over a lot of different things, and three, something I don't want to get in the weeds about my own. We should talk about other issues because I don't want to belabor the point. I got a phone call from the President of the United States the day before I was asked to resign, and I did not return the phone call because I thought it was inappropriate for a sitting United States attorney, in particular one who had particular kinds of jurisdiction and was being asked to investigate various things, to have an unmonitored phone call with the President of the United States. You know how many calls I got from Barack Obama during the 8 years I was U.S. Attorney? Zero. And so the combination of being asked to stay, having this peculiar phone call, the origin of which I did not understand, the nature of which I did not understand, and the jurisdiction I had, I just wanted to be on the record that the President himself was firing me, and this wasn't just another sweeping, incompetent kind of decision, sort of in the same way they rolled out the travel ban that I'm sure everyone here read about, and not to compare myself to them, but I felt a little bit like the first day, like the folks who were legal permanent residents in the United States and weren't sure Are they included in the travel ban? Are they not included in the travel ban? And on the first day, I wasn't even being defiant. I was trying to understand, was this a mistake or not? I didn't want to resign the job by accident. So I was asking so that was a Friday, I was asking on the Friday, are you sure it applies to me? And literally it is true, and then we can move on to something else. Literally it is true that reporters were calling and saying, well, does this apply to Preet? And I said, I have no idea. And they would call the White House, and some people at the White House said, call the Justice Department. And other people at the White House said, it does include Preet, and other people said it did not include Preet. So I said, at this point, it's so uncertain and it's so unclear. I just want the record to reflect for posterity that it wasn't some, acting functionary who decided to dismiss me. I wanted the record to be clear that it was a deliberate decision by the president in all the circumstances to fire me, and so here I am.
So to wrap that up, what do you think changed between November and the 10th of March?
I have no idea. Look, I have not made any accusation against anyone. I have no idea what is true, what is not true. But in the fullness of seeing what happened to Jim Comey and to other folks, nothing would surprise me. I don't know what's true and what's not true. It may be just a function of people thinking that anybody who was appointed by Barack Obama, no matter what they did and how independent they were and how nonpartisan they were, did not deserve to serve anymore. I don't know. But it's an unusual way to have gone about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've seen kind of challenges to prosecutorial independence and to what can be characterized as the justice system and the rule of law overall, I think, in the States. What do you think people should be doing to organize to reignite confidence in the justice system and its organs?
Yeah, so I don't know if that can be done through organizing. I think, and this seems obvious to me, that if you have a point of view and you were worried about institutions in your country, and we're talking about the United States, then you should say something about it. And then you should call on all the institutions that have some ability to be a check and a balance against what you may perceive, given the spirit of your question, as overreaching power by the president and the executive, to offset that. So for example, we have, and I think we borrowed it from somewhere, a system of checks and balances. So you have Congress and you have the courts, and the courts you don't really lobby, but they, I think, have proven themselves to be fairly independent. I don't think there's been a single significant court decision in favor of the travel ban. But there's also Congress, and Congress right now, both the Senate and the House are majority Republican. Again, there's nothing wrong with it being Republican. That's how the voters chose. But if you believe institutionally, not as a partisan matter, but institutionally, that Congress is one of the two checks against the president, then I think one of the things you should do if you're thinking about this and organizing is to call upon your elected representatives to make sure they're holding the president accountable. I mean, one of the things I did when I worked in the Senate before I went to the U.S. Attorney's Office, I worked for a senator and I was on the Judiciary Committee. We conducted a bipartisan independent investigation of the Bush Justice Department based on a lot of things that they were doing that we thought were politicizing justice back in 2007. So it can be done, but it has to be done in a bipartisan way because people have to care about their country and the rule of law more than they care about their party.
Do you think that will be sufficient to reestablish confidence in the justice system while President Trump's still in the White House?
I think it depends on what the president does. I think it depends on the kinds of judges that he appoints. I think it depends on what unfolds with the investigation into the Russia connection. Look, there's some things that have given more confidence. The week that Jim Comey was fired, I think a lot of people were rightly upset and worried whether or not you thought that the head of the FBI behaved correctly and properly and exquisitely perfectly last summer. I know a lot of people don't think he did. But the timing and the reasoning for his firing, given a few weeks ago, struck nobody as true. And not only did it strike nobody as true, it was proven not to be true because the president himself said something contrary to what the Deputy Attorney General said. Rod Rosenstein, who's another U.S. attorney, is a colleague of mine who I know to be an honorable lawyer. They basically used him, and they got him. I don't know how many people have followed this. They used him and got him to write a memo, which I see a video. I was going to use a legal term. The memo was crap. And if a junior lawyer in my office had written that memo and then said we're going to use that to justify some significant action, and that action, in this case, being the sacking of the person who is leading the investigation of the President of the United States, at the same time that there are all these questions about the Russia connection and Michael Flynn and everything else, I would have said you might want to reconsider and add some addendums to the memo. But there's good news though. The point of this was good news. So he does that, and I think there was, and who knows what lies in the hearts and minds of men and what motivates them. But that happened, I think, on a Monday or a Tuesday, and in the ensuing days, there was a firestorm because Donald Trump went on television later that week and said, "Oh, I was definitely going to fire him before I got the memo, and I definitely was thinking about the Russia investigation." And everyone says, "Well, what the hell is going on?" Which I know people say a lot these days. What the heck is going on? And then Rod Rosenstein, who's now the acting attorney general for all of these matters because Jeff Sessions had to recuse himself, which is another issue, he had a decision to make. And he cared about his reputation in the world, and he cared about his reputation, because he's not a politician, he must have cared about his reputation as a lawyer. He's not as young as I am. I'm much younger than he is. But he's a young guy who's going to be living and practicing at a high level in law for some years. And so he decided, again, against, clearly, as far as we can see from the reaction, against the wishes and hopes of the White House, to appoint, to my mind, the best possible person who could have been appointed, a special counsel, Robert Mueller, who had been the FBI director before Jim Comey had taken it over. So the long-winded point is there are enough checks in the system. Reputational damage matters. People, yelling out and speaking out. I mean, I did my part. I wrote an op-ed, the first op-ed I'd written in years in the Washington Post, asking for the appointment of a special counsel. And if there's enough of that, I think people in good faith who may have made a mistake, and I think his memo originally, Rod Rosenstein's memo, was a mistake, can be counted upon, hopefully, to do the right thing. And now I think the course of that investigation is going to be independent. Nobody messes around with Robert Mueller, and everyone is watching. And so any attempt to mess around with it is going to be treated in a very serious way. That doesn't mean that more craziness will not ensue, but there's a consequence now, I think, to try to derail things that are in motion.
Okay, sure. Turning to a different track, I suppose, I'm sure lots of questions will pick up on this. You have, prosecuted some of the biggest cases of insider trading or corporate malpractice. I'm sure lots of people in this audience are going to go into, very nicely paid jobs in the city or in different, financial sectors. What would you say to them if they come across, corruption, if they come across malpractice, and what they're going to do?
Well, in the old days, I would say you should call me. Now, I can give you a number of someone to call. Look, what I will say is there's such a thing as law and understanding statutes and understanding the ethical rules. And that's important, and you should learn them. But there's also such a thing as understanding what's in your gut and what's in your conscience. And when I speak to groups of folks like this at esteemed institutions who are going to go on and become business leaders and government leaders and help to rule the world, because we really need it, so thank you. My worry is you're going to go someplace. So if you learn nothing else from this talk, just think about this. You're going to go to a bank or a hedge fund or a consulting firm, or even maybe Parliament or somewhere else. And someone is going to say that they want you engage in a practice, or you see a practice being engaged in, that's going to seem fishy to you. And it's going to not make you feel right about what is going on. And your first reaction, because you're good people and honest and honorable and smart, is going to be, that seems wrong, I don't think we should do that, or I think I should maybe report it to somebody, or I should ask some questions about it. And my worry is your next response is going to be, because I see this all the time with respect to people that we used to arrest, your next reaction is going to be, well, what do I know? I'm young, these seem like very nice people. I'm sure they know what the law is better than I do, I'm sure they know what the rules are better than I know, and I don't want to be a fly in the ointment and upset the apple cart and any other metaphor you want to use. And so I'm going to keep my mouth shut. And you'd be surprised how often that happens. And my point to you is, when that does happen, remember, you're here for a reason. You didn't get to where you got unless you had a good moral compass and you had a sense of integrity and you understand what's right and wrong. And chances are, if you think wherever you end up going that something bad is happening, you were probably right. And you shouldn't suppress it. And you should either do something about it or you should leave. And then people always ask me, well, jobs are hard to get. This is a high-paying job. And what I say to them is, that's fine, but there is risk associated with going to a place where you think bad things are happening. And our office prosecuted SAC Capital. We prosecuted Raj Rajaratnam's fund Galleon Group. We prosecuted the Madoff, many members of the Madoff family and other people who worked at the firm. And we prosecuted a small number of people at all of those places. But the other people who didn't get prosecuted and may have been fully innocent, still, because life is life, and this is how the world works, and employers are going to notice on your resume that you worked at one of those places, those people had a harder time getting a job. And they may have made a little bit more money going to a place that was reputationally challenged before they went. So just think about, when you're thinking about going to firm A versus firm B, the reputation for integrity of the firm matters, not only just because it'll make your family feel better, but also the long-term risk to you will be lower, even if you make a few fewer dollars or pounds.
Thanks for that. And moving from our own future careers, what's next for you? Is there any other challenge that you're particularly interested in taking?
I'm told that next for me is we're having drinks upstairs. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, that's far enough ahead. Great. Well, let's take a few questions from the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand. If you are selected, wait for the microphone to reach you. It will not amplify your voice, but will record you. So please speak clearly into the microphone. Let's go to the very enthusiastic individual there under the lamp.
Hi there. With regard to the point about insider trading that you mentioned at the end, with the benefit of hindsight, and aside from your view on the holding of the case, do you think it was a mistake to try to prosecute Newman and Kyasan?
No.
And do you regret at all kind of the way in which the case was presented to the media, when in the end several people who were held not to have violated any laws had their careers destroyed because of the prosecution?
Yeah, look, as far as I'm concerned, they were guilty of the crime, and the Supreme Court upheld, after a long battle, I don't know if you followed that, 8-0, in striking down, I don't know if people are following this, but clearly you have a strong view on this particular point. There was a case of insider trading that we brought the Intermediate Court of Appeals, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals for the non-Americans who were aspiring to be lawyers, had a couple of rulings in the case, one of which basically said that in order for something to be insider trading, the person who is giving the tip of the material non-public information has to receive something of pecuniary concrete value in return. And sometimes you have that. People will give a tip in return for business, or in return for a cut of the profit, et cetera. But sometimes it's the case that people are giving material non-public information of a very sensitive nature and expecting nothing in return. And so the case turned on the question of whether or not that's enough. And the Second Circuit opinion got it completely wrong, didn't understand what prior Supreme Court precedent had held in a case called United States versus called Dirks. And so a number of cases were dismissed. We persisted in appealing on the issue of whether or not there had to be a concrete pecuniary benefit back. They did not take the Supreme Court did not take the case in our posture. But there was another case, again, this is getting too much in the weeds, but for this gentleman, the case then went, there was another case that was similar in California in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. The Supreme Court held that the Second Circuit case was incorrect and that it was not necessary to show that there was pecuniary benefit for a common sense reason. That would mean then that anybody who had access to inside information, you could be the Fortune 500, a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and decide on the golf course you were going to gift to your child, or you're going to gift to your friend from college the information that says that we're going to beat street estimates by $2 a share when everyone else thinks they're going to lose money. And you could literally be gifting them $50 million, and that would be untouchable by prosecutors. And the Supreme Court, by the way, in the United States, that has not recently been any big fan of allowing prosecutorial discretion, ruled very quickly, even with an incomplete bench, 8-0 in our favor. So I don't regret bringing the case because I think we were vindicated.
Thank you. Let's take another question. Let's go to the hand at the end of the row here.
Hi, so I'm a resident of New York State, and I'm a little curious about your views on whether you think...
Are there any people from the UK here? Next question has got to go to a local.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm a little curious so obviously Albany has some ethical issues going on,
yes.
And I'm curious whether... what your opinions are on Andrew Cuomo and whether he's involved in this in any way, whether just being blind to this, or whether he should have known about it, or whether you actually think he's done anything.
So Andrew Cuomo is the governor of the state of New York. We are not friends. At one point, I feel like I'm doing a lot of catching people up. So at one point, we have this corruption issue. We arrested and charged and convicted more elected officials in New York than I think anyone in recent or even medieval history. Democrats and Republicans. We prosecuted successfully both the head of the Senate in the state, who was a Republican, and the head of the Assembly, who was a Democrat. So again, nonpartisan, just fighting corruption. And when some of these cases were coming through the courts, the governor decided to establish an anti-corruption commission called the Moreland Commission. It was with great fanfare. And then 9 months later, under weird circumstances, he disbanded the commission, which I thought was odd, and I said some things about it publicly. And then we seized all the files of the Moreland Commission and said, well, if you're not going to do it, then we'll do it. It became public that we were investigating the nature of some of the things that the Moreland Commission had done, and whether or not there had been interference or obstruction, and whether or not there was something untoward in the closure of the Moreland Commission. We issued a very brief public statement saying that we had insufficient evidence to bring a charge against anyone in connection with that. So that's how I'm going to answer that question. On the other hand, I will say that, look, there is responsibility for dealing with corruption, whether you're talking about London or Albany or anywhere else, on the part of everybody in government. So, one job is for prosecutors to do the job that they can and to make the cases they can make that are consistent with the law and in the interest of justice, and hopefully that deters people and gets rid of the bad people. There's also a role for the press and a role for the public, but there's also a role for other people in government who have an ability to get better laws passed. And I think I can say without fear of contradiction that Andrew Cuomo has shown very little interest in doing any of those things.
Great. Right. Let's have a non-New York State resident to ask the next question. Is there anybody? Oh, wow. Okay, yeah, there's a volunteer over there. That hand I can see. Yeah, he's not from New York.
Thank you very much for coming. You've talked a little about the Supreme Court, and you've talked.
You sound like you're from New York, though.
Just a sore throat. You talked a bit about the Supreme Court, and you talked a bit about hiring and firing. So I suppose it's natural to talk about Judge Gorsuch. What are your views on him, and also on Merrick Garland, the pair of them, and Merrick Garland's recent nomination for being talked about in the same breath as the FBI director?
Yes, I'm not going to comment on what I think about Gorsuch and what kind of justice he's going to be. The other thing that I used to do in my life when I was in the Senate was not only conduct this investigation, but we have advise and consent and in the Senate on judicial nominees to the court, and in particular the Supreme Court. And so one of the things I did when I left the prosecutor's office in 2005 was I worked on the Supreme Court confirmation hearings of both Chief Justice Roberts and Sam Alito. So I spent a lot of time. That's how I spent the entire year of 2005. So I know the process is a difficult one. It's become a very polarized and unfortunately politicized one. So answering in reverse, on the issue of Merrick Garland, who I know and respect, and he's been a very well-respected judge in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals for a long time, I think it was pretty shameful how he was treated. And I think that had the position been reversed, that Republicans would have said the same thing had a Democrat done it. So that's not a partisan statement on my part. I think it was shameful institutionally that a president is entitled to his picks and entitled to votes on his picks to the Supreme Court, so long as that person is in office. But like everything else in the world these days, and particularly in America, if there's an opportunity to get an advantage because you can make an argument because it's close to an election, people will take advantage of that. The worry is it's going to happen again and again and again. I mean, there used to be the case when I was in the Senate in America. There was all this sturm and drang over whether or not we should take away the need to have a certain number of votes to confirm a Supreme Court nominee. And it was called the nuclear option back then. And I remember I stayed up till midnight one night writing a speech for the senator for whom I worked on how outrageous this would be. And then it came to pass anyway 10 years later. So I do think that this is true in institutions generally, that where people really care about outcomes and results, politics will interfere. And I think that's what happened in that case. But I can't predict what kind of a associate justice he will be.
Cool. Okay, let's go to the person second in there. Yeah, just looking back now.
Okay. I'm also American. I'm so sorry.
Don't apologize for being American. It's Memorial Day.
Okay, thank you so much for being here. Your work really is such an inspiration. So I have a question about just given the scope of the caseload in the Southern District. Obviously, you're known for very rigorous investigations into Wall Street, New York politicians, criminal gangs, those sorts of things. But just with that kind of caseload and how diverse that is, how did you prioritize cases, and what kind of things did you have to think about when deciding how to allocate resources for different investigations or to continue certain investigations versus starting new ones? Thank you.
That's a great question and a very broad one. I'll say two quick things. One is, when I first was nominated and about to become the U.S. Attorney, I went and got advice from a lot of people. And some people said to me, and this is a leadership point that people make all the time, and they say, and it's a phrase that people use all the time, they say, if everything is a priority, then nothing is a priority. And that sounded very clever to me. And I said, if everything's a priority, then nothing's a priority. I don't know what the hell that means, really, other than it means if you run an institution that has lots of resources, you are making deliberate decisions to let some things suffer and fail and not do well. And so it occurred to me over time, I think what that means is, on any given day, given, especially for someone like me with limited brain capacity, you can only focus on, 1, 2, 3, 4 things. You can't have 12 priorities every day. But in our office, let's say my criminal division had, sort of 11 units. We had, organized crime, you have gangs, you have cyber, you have terrorism, you have financial crime, you name it. There's no way that on any given day I can focus on all of it. But over time, one of the things I'm proud of is I don't think that any area of my office, if you ask them after the course of 7.5 years, did any of them felt neglected over the course of that time. There were some periods, because when we were prosecuting the politicians in New York, that probably if you looked at a pie chart of my time, much of it was being spent on the public corruption. There were other times when it was being spent on terrorism. Other times it was spent on cyber. So it depends on what's going on. And if you put good people in places, then nothing has to fall by the wayside. Second answer to your question, though, the world changes, threats change, the law changes. And I would say that the biggest change from the time that I started in 2009, this is important for all of you because it may inform how you think about the jobs you might seek and where there's job security. The cyber threat has gone up, infinitely since the time that I started. When I started in the U.S. Attorney's Office, we had one guy, Tom. Tom was the expert on all cyber things, and we realized that that was really not enough. Tom was great, but we needed a lot more Toms. And so, in fairly short order, we began to train other people and get other people to come along and understand how to deal with the international threat of cyber. And by the way, at that point, nobody was even talking about how involved China was in engaging in cybercrime and cyber espionage. You didn't have the president talking about it. You didn't have the Secretary of Defense talking about it. You didn't have world leaders talking about it. That has all changed over the course of time. So, you end up taking resources from places where you don't need them as much. The FBI, for example, used to have, 5 or 6 organized crime squads. The mafia squads. Every organized crime family had a squad devoted to it. Gambino, Lucchese, you name it. Those got reduced, and some of those resources went to cyber. And that's a natural, I think, occurring event, and you should always think about those things when you lead an institution.
Great, thank you. Let's go to, hand over there.
The day that the president of Turkey paid a visit to President Trump.
Are you from New York?
DC. No, I'm from Turkey.
Okay. It's my other fan base.
So the day that Erdogan paid a visit to President Trump in DC, you tweeted something in the ballpark of, I hope this meeting is being taped. So I wonder whether you had any reason to believe that President of Turkey or Trump made any attempts to interfere with one of the investigations that you were handling.
Well, look, I know for a fact, so President Erdogan and I also don't get along. President Erdogan has publicly accused me of assisting in the coup in Turkey. I'm not a violent man. I think it's also known that he personally exclaimed about me to Vice President Biden when he was the vice president about some nonsensical affiliation I have, again, to educate people who are not following all this, with a cleric, Fethullah Gulen, who lives in the Poconos, who I'd never heard of and had to Google after we arrested Reza Zarrab, who's the individual who's Iranian but from Turkey that you're referring to. The president of Turkey has publicly said that I have visited Turkey, separate and apart from apparently to plan for the coup that I was part of. So I was making a sort of a self-deprecating, humorous reference to the fact that you have a president of a country who was lying about little old Preet and being responsible for various things. That's all I meant by that.
But I thought it sounded like Trump was also negotiating something.
Look, I don't know. Erdogan has made it very clear. Look, here's the special thing about democracies where law enforcement is independent. We bring our cases not because the State Department tells us to do them or not do them. And some of the big fights I had when I was the U.S. Attorney were on these issues of how much to consider international affairs and foreign policy, hence, the joke about our own foreign policy. We're not trying to mess up alliances in the world. On the other hand, it is not a great thing if an independent office brings a righteous case that's wending through the system, and a leader of another country, whether through lies or otherwise, this is just extra gravy on how nonsensical it is that it's intertwined with lies and ridiculousness, can call someone up and say, can you get that guy to stand down on the case? That's not how it works in America. And there is some concern because you had, again, I'm not making any allegation to see the recorder on. But one of the issues of Michael Flynn, the National Security Advisor, was he had not revealed that he was a paid lobbyist for the Turkish government. So you have a lot of weird things going on. And so it'd be nice to know, what's on the up and up and what's on the level.
From this and lots of other things we've discussed, you're clearly not afraid of, kicking the hornet's nest and going after, some of the top people out there. To aspiring prosecutors or people still around, what gave you this kind of, not just confidence, but a drive to say, I'm going to take on this hugely challenging and complex investigation because, I want to deliver a case and put it in front of the courts?
I think it was Indian food growing up. I would eat a lot of tandoori chicken. Yeah. That's helpful.
Lots of fire in the belly. Yeah.
No, I don't see it as no prosecutor should be going out in the world and relishing kicking a hornet's nest. What you have to be thinking is you need to go about doing your job. It's a very simple philosophy I have. I sometimes quote from the movie The Departed. It's a Scorsese movie, which is great. And there's a scene where you thought I was going to quote from Shakespeare. No. And I don't care if it's Oxford. And there's a scene in the film where Mark Wahlberg, something has gone wrong in the sting, and Mark Wahlberg is sitting at his desk, and some guy comes in, and they were supposed to have the videotapes going when there was a sting operator, and they didn't have the videotapes going. And so everyone's upset, and some guy walks in and says, "Who the F are you?" And Wahlberg says, "I'm the guy who does his job. You must be the other guy." The point of which is, I think prosecutors are supposed to do their job. And if a complaint comes in, or a person gets shot, or you get information about a crime being committed, you have to follow it to the logical ends of what the law tells you is appropriate and what the facts tell you is appropriate. And that's what distinguishes an independent legal system. And if along the way some people get upset about it, you have to have the fortitude to say, well, I don't give a damn, because that's what the people are paying us to do. And that's why I think, the system withstands a lot of scrutiny. Look, there were a lot of people in my office, around in New York and other places, as you've heard from some of the questions, who were prepared to say, Bharara is bringing that case because he's a Democrat or because he's Republican. I'll give you an example of a case. We brought a case against an Indian diplomat who I had also never heard of, Devyani Khobragade, which, by the way, that's another, so I couldn't go to India for a while. And the government there, it was on the eve of an election, and this person had committed not the crime of the century, but the State Department career agents and career prosecutors did this case, and the day before they said, by the way, we're making this arrest tomorrow. I'm like, okay. Little did I know that I was, within the course of 3 days, going to become literally the most hated person in the country of my birth. My parents are calling me, Preet, what did you do? They're like, we clearly didn't give you enough chicken when you were growing up. And the point is, people in India didn't understand when they called John Kerry and said, can't you tell Preet's office just to dismiss the case? That's not how it works. And you just have to proceed based on what you think is appropriate with respect to the law. And people will judge your motivations. Like my favorite story about that whole thing is, people would write in India, like, why is Preet doing this thing? I hate to talk about myself in the third person, but it's become common in certain precincts in Washington, in my country now. And they assumed it was something other than just doing your job, right? From the movie, we're just doing our jobs, man. And people would write, well, he's trying to cozy up to people, and some people begin to write, when they couldn't say you're anti-Indian, they would have to say you're self-loathing in some way, and suggested that I was doing this to enhance my own political future, as if the people of Schenectady, New York, were going to vote more for me if I was interested in politics because we prosecuted some mid-level diplomat who nobody had ever heard of and was not going to hear of again. So it was a lot of nonsense. My favorite was, this is literally true, someone in a newspaper in India speculated and said, opined that clearly Bharara is doing this, bringing this case, which I'd never heard of before, is bringing this case to serve his white masters, presumably Eric Holder and Barack Obama.
Great. Let's take one or two more questions from the audience. Yeah, let's go to the lady at the end of the row there. Thank you.
Just to stick with the theme of war stories from your time, what was the most personally satisfying case that you oversaw in your time in the Southern District of New York?
Oh, there's no personally satisfying. That's a great question.
Or least satisfying, the same token.
God, that's a really good question. The reason I balked at your question is that nothing should be, personally satisfying. I'll tell you the class of cases that make you grateful. Our office gets a lot of attention. Some of the cases make news even in other countries. But there are a lot of things that we do that don't get as much attention, and that are for people who don't have anyone to fight for them and don't have anybody to care about them. And if they're not a rich person who, and by the way, I was astounded at how much attention was paid to the insider trading cases. And they would have, and reporters would say, like, why do you care so much about insider trading cases? Like, I don't, you do. Because there are multiple, they're the same as the other cases. And there was a point where I had done just as many public events and press conferences on gang violence that was going on in the Bronx and in Manhattan and other parts, and in Yonkers, New York, which was a violent place, as I had done on insider trading cases. The difference is there are rich people who are telling secrets, and you have the Wall Street Journal, and you have multiple 24-hour financial news networks for whom this was sexy and salacious material. And to my knowledge, to this day, there's no 24-hour gang channel. So it didn't get the same attention. And so, this is not as satisfying an answer as you might want. But some of the cases we did just to protect neighborhoods. Some of the cases we did with respect to people who have disabilities, and to make sure that they can have access to restaurants and to concert venues and to the New York City public schools, which I didn't get to finish, because people don't realize that you have architects who decide to build a new restaurant that they want people to enjoy, but they build steps when they shouldn't be building steps, even though in America at least, we've had laws on the books for 27 years saying you have to take these things into account. And so those are the quieter, less known cases that really help people and affected their lives that don't get the same kind of coverage. So, I always like to talk about those when I get a question like that.
Great. Yeah, towards the back, just a few rows back. Again, the aisle seat.
In light of Comey's firing, there was speak of both appointing a special prosecutor as well as a special counsel. What are the differences between the two, if there are any? And what are some of the major challenges you see facing Robert Mueller
Facing which?
The new special counsel in the Russia investigation?
Oh, yeah.
In the coming months.
So it's very confusing. The independent counsel, independent prosecutor, special counsel. For now, basically all you can have is a special counsel. So it doesn't matter what the relative merits are. The independent prosecutor statute lapsed and was allowed to lapse by the American Congress. So that means, the limitation now on the special counsel is the special counsel can be fired. No one hopes, he won't be, but he can be. What are the challenges facing Robert Mueller? You name it, he's got the challenge. He's got a challenge of resources, he's got a challenge of the whole world, not just the United States, looking at what he's doing. He's got to make sure that he's staffing up in a way that everyone, is doing what I said before, just doing their job and not thinking about politics and not thinking about the end result and keeping an open mind. I think it is, on a personal level, I think the challenge in any kind of politically charged case, it's a big problem, is that whatever result you reach, some substantial percentage of people won't believe it was in good faith. That's why it's important that Bob Mueller has the reputation that he has. But I guarantee you, there are going to be people who will trash his reputation if he makes a recommendation to prosecute, or if he makes a reputation not to prosecute. And it's an alarming thing that's happening now, where you used to have people who were very divided on hot-button social issues, which you can understand. And some people had a certain view of God, and some people have a different view of God, and that's a very sort of, internally, conscientiously held view, whether you're talking about abortion or you're talking about the death penalty or something else. And it used to be, I think, that kind of passionate view, an unpersuadable position, was reserved for things like that. I now think that it is also extended as to the guiltiness of public figures. So there are all these people who don't know anything about anything, but hated Hillary Clinton. And maybe she should have been, maybe she shouldn't have been. I'm not pronouncing on that. Who thought, lock her up. Hillary Clinton must be guilty of a crime. And then there were lots of other people who also know nothing, but who liked Hillary Clinton and thought that was absurd. And now you have, just a few months later, you have a whole group of people who think absolutely certainly Donald Trump has committed obstruction and he should be locked up. And you have also people who know nothing and haven't been involved in the investigation saying the opposite. And I'm pretty confident that it's the same people who have switched their positions about what's criminal and what's not. That's a terrible position to be with. And that's just one way of explaining what I think a challenge is. It's not just, one of the reasons I spoke a lot as the U.S. Attorney is it's not only important, if you go into justice, it's not only important that justice be done, but in civilized, open, democratic society, justice has to be done and it has to be seen to be done. Because otherwise, the decisions you make are not authoritative. So if it became the case in my state and in my district that people couldn't trust, am I bringing a case because I'm a Democrat as opposed to because it's the right thing to do, then justice is lost. So, you hope and pray that he crosses every T, dots every I, has only the best and brightest and people who are above politics working for him, so that whatever he decides ultimately is respected. And I think the more people who in advance say we will respect whatever decision is made, the better. That to me is the biggest challenge.
Great. Another question. Yeah, the end of the row over there.
Thank you so much for coming. As a law student who aspires perhaps not to have a career in the city, but kind of sees the law as a vehicle to actually affect useful change in the world, and also as a law student who sees great cuts to legal aid funding within the UK, and broadly a kind of devaluing of public work that is done with this kind of idea of serving the broader public, how would you advise some of the students here in pursuing careers which perhaps won't give them dividends immediately, but might lead to something more meaningful when this kind of work is generally being devalued?
You should do it. Keep, people who devalue, if I was still prosecuting, I would prosecute those people. People should not be devaluing good work, whether it's government, whether it's on the defense side, whether it's trying to help impoverished people in other countries, whether it's to eradicate disease or anything else. That's why we have so many problems. And look, off the top of my head, I think, markets work. And to the extent, and trends happen, right? And, there was a movement in the United States some time ago, Teach for America, and, the Peace Corps. And if really, really smart people who go here very proudly announce that they're going to do this other work in defiance of what, their parental aspirations may be for them, or other people may think of them, then they can go to hell. Because the more people who do what you're talking about, the better the world will be, and then other people will aspire to do those things too. I think you should not only do those things, you should talk about them, and talk about the concrete advances that you're making when you go into those areas, and then proselytize to the next generation of people when you come back. And I also think, the people who don't go into those areas, maybe this is off the top of my head, that's a good question. So let's say you decide you don't care about poverty at this moment so much that you're going to go help alleviate it somewhere else. And instead you're running a bank or some huge other multi-country conglomerate, you should find ways to support the work that she's talking about, so that there are people who are able to go do that work and are proud to do that work. Just because you're not doing it yourself doesn't mean you shouldn't be supportive of it. And I think the more people who have that point of view, the better.
Great. We've got time for one final question. So let's go to, person second along the row there.
So you have this like impeccable reputation for being very nonpartisan.
New York.
Boston.
Okay.
So I'm a clinician scientist in training, and one really important aspect in a patient relationship is to not prejudge someone. And so can you kind of talk about how in this really polarizing environment, in your environment, right? How do you maintain this nonpartisan reputation? And what's kind of like your intellectual toolkit that allows you to really think in that manner?
Right. So I think actually the prejudgment issue is a much broader and deeper problem than partisanship. I mean, if you have anybody in a prosecutor's office who has any whiff of, I'm going to do this or that because I have a political view, that's death, and that person should be fired immediately. I like to say there are three political parties in the United States. There's Democrat, there's Republican, and there's federal prosecutor. But I mean, you understand the point I'm making there. But on the issue of prejudgment, so that's just as a base matter. I think there's a bigger problem with prejudgment on the part of investigating officials and prosecutors, which is things look like they might be true at the beginning of an inquiry. Okay, do I have time to tell a very quick story?
Yeah, go for it.
So, and it's something I'm planning to speak about and write about more, because you got to make sure that everyone keeps healthy skepticism, even as facts are being found and seem to be leading you towards the path of a particular conclusion. This is true also in science. It's true also in everything else that you can imagine, not just law and order. There was, the Madrid, I talked about this recently at a commencement address because I was reminded of it. So the Manchester bombing, horrible. But I was reminded of another terrible attack in Europe, the train bombings on 3/11 in 2004 in Madrid. A case to which I was assigned because the FBI was providing support internationally when I was a young line prosecutor to their efforts. And it's all publicly known now. So the Spaniards authorities found a plastic bag that had detonators in it, copper detonators in it, and tried to test it for fingerprints. Didn't find any match. So they sent it to the premier fingerprinting agency in the world. They sent it to the FBI, and the FBI did an analysis, and they lifted a fingerprint. And they called it latent fingerprint 17. And latent fingerprint 17, from the premier law enforcement institution in the world, said it belonged to a gentleman by the name of Brandon Mayfield. Brandon Mayfield was an American living comfortably at that time in Portland, Oregon. Brandon Mayfield happened to have married a Muslim Egyptian woman some years earlier, happened to have converted to Islam himself, and then also happened, based on their investigation, to, as a lawyer, represent a convicted terrorist who had provided material support, I think, to Al-Qaeda, if not also Al-Shabaab. Not in the criminal case, but in the civil case. So you got a fingerprint, then you have converted Muslim, married a Muslim, and defended a terrorist. So searches were done, FISA warrants were taken out. I thought the case was going to come to me. It was going to be, a career-making case. We lost the case in a turf battle to the U.S. Attorney in Oregon, thankfully. Because it turns out that there were some problems. One problem was that there was no other evidence that Brandon Mayfield had ever traveled to Spain. In fact, there was no evidence that Brandon Mayfield had ever traveled outside the country in recent years. There was no evidence he had gotten training in Afghanistan. There's no evidence of anything else. So it was very peculiar. So they didn't arrest him, but they took him on the charge, but they took him into custody and kept him imprisoned for 2 weeks on a material witness warrant. Well, the other problem was the fingerprint didn't belong to him. The FBI had made a mistake. It belonged to someone else who lived in a completely different country. And so the question is, how does that happen? When you talk about prejudging something, the Inspector General did a whole report, which is good, and this is an example I'm going to use when I train and talk to other people, so I'm glad you asked me about it. The report was, there is a powerful gravitational pull towards the first conclusion that someone makes on an issue. And it turns out that the first examiner had not taken the care to look at the original fingerprint, had not flown to Spain to look at the original fingerprint, but looked at a poor digital image and had made some errors. But then the second person had, surmised, a little bit of a bias in favor of the first person, and the third person in favor of the first two people. So all of a sudden you have three people saying that this print must match Brandon Mayfield, and then the report concludes there may not have been overt, stereotyping or prejudice against Islam, but it concludes, I think, relatively credibly, that the fact that he had converted to Islam and he defended a terrorist probably cause them to be less likely to revisit their first conclusion, even when things seem to be funny. So anyway, it's a long-winded way of saying it's a good story for you to remember that the way you deal with prejudging things is you tell stories like that, you ask people to make sure that they are open-minded and skeptical with respect to each fact that they learn, and go back and revisit the facts that they thought they learned before.
Okay, great. Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for, but thank you so much for making the trip over to the UK.
Thanks, folks.
Speaking here tonight, it's a good thing you've not been banned from the UK yet.
Not yet.
Yeah.
Maybe after today.
Yeah. So thank you.